After the chaos that shattered the old kingdom, Egypt did something remarkable. It rebuilt itself, not once but twice, each time emerging stronger, richer, and more determined to prove its gods had never truly abandoned it. But the second rebirth, known to history as the New Kingdom, was unlike anything that came before. This was not simply an era of pyramids and quiet farming villages along the Nile. This was Egypt transformed into a military superpower, its armies marching into Nubia, Canaan, and Syria, its treasuries overflowing with foreign gold, and its pharaohs commanding chariots, bows, and professional soldiers on a scale the ancient world had rarely witnessed. It produced a queen who ruled as a king in her own right and defended her legitimacy with propaganda still studied today. It produced a religious revolutionary who tried to overthrow 1,000 years of tradition in favor of a single sun disk, plunging the kingdom into controversy so severe his own name was later erased from history. And it produced warrior kings who fought the greatest battles of the ancient Near East, signed the world's first recorded peace treaty, and built monuments so vast that tourists still stand beneath them in awe thousands of years later. This is the story of Egypt at the absolute height of its power, and the extraordinary individuals who built, defended, and very nearly destroyed it. The first intermediate period, that fractured era following the collapse of the Old Kingdom, did not last forever. Around 2055 BCE, a ruler from the southern city of Thebes named Mentuhotep II succeeded in reunifying Egypt through military campaigns against rival regional powers, inaugurating what modern historians call the Middle Kingdom. This period restored centralized authority, expanded Egyptian control southward into Nubia, and produced its own flourishing of literature, art, and architecture, though on a somewhat different scale than the pyramid-building extravagance of the Old Kingdom. Middle Kingdom pharaohs invested heavily in irrigation projects, particularly around the Fayum region, expanding agricultural land and further strengthening the economic base of the state. Yet like its predecessor, the Middle Kingdom eventually weakened, and Egypt again fractured during what is called the Second Intermediate Period, when a foreign group known as the Hyksos, likely originating from the Levant, gained control over parts of the Nile Delta, ruling as pharaohs themselves for roughly a century. The presence of foreign rulers on Egyptian soil, controlling a portion of what Egyptians considered sacred and divinely ordained territory, proved to be a profound humiliation, and it was this humiliation that helped forge the fierce, expansionist character of the new kingdom that followed. Around 1550 BCE, a Theban ruler named Ahmose I successfully expelled the Hyksos from Egypt, reunifying the country and founding the 18th dynasty. But Ahmose and his successors did not stop at Egypt's traditional borders. Having learned hard lessons about the dangers of foreign incursion, New Kingdom pharaohs adopted a new strategy. Rather than waiting to be invaded, they would build a buffer empire, projecting Egyptian military power deep into neighboring territories in Nubia to the south and the Levant to the northeast, ensuring no foreign power could threaten the Nile Valley again. This shift transformed Egypt into something genuinely new, an imperial military state. Pharaohs like Thutmose I and his grandson Thutmose III led repeated campaigns into Syria and Canaan, fighting coalition armies of local kings at battles such as Megiddo, one of the earliest battles in history for which we have a detailed written account, recorded on temple walls at Karnak. Thutmose III, often called Egypt's Napoleon by modern historians for his relentless campaigning, conducted at least 17 military campaigns during his reign, pushing Egyptian influence as far as the Euphrates River in modern Syria, and securing tribute, prisoners, and resources from a network of vassal kingdoms that stretched across the Near East. Egyptian armies during this period relied heavily on the horse-drawn chariot. A technology adopted and refined after encounters with foreign powers, combined with composite bows and professional infantry, creating a military machine considerably more sophisticated than the largely defensive forces of earlier Egyptian eras. Yet not every notable ruler of this era came to power through the battlefield. One of the most extraordinary figures of the entire New Kingdom was Hatshepsut, who began as regent for her young stepson Thutmose III but eventually assumed the full formal title and regalia of Pharaoh herself, ruling Egypt as a fully legitimate king for approximately 2 decades. This was an almost unprecedented situation in Egyptian history, and Hatshepsut approached it with remarkable political sophistication. Official artwork and inscriptions from her reign frequently depicted her in the traditional regalia of a male pharaoh, including the ceremonial false beard associated with kingship, not because Egyptians believed she was actually male, but because the entire visual language of legitimate rulership had been built around masculine imagery for over 1,000 years, and Hatshepsut needed to align herself with that established symbolism to secure her authority. Rather than focusing primarily on military conquest, Hatshepsut's reign emphasized trade, particularly a famous expedition to the distant land of Punt, likely located along the Red Sea coast of modern Somalia or Eritrea, which returned laden with incense, exotic animals, gold, and ebony, all depicted in detailed relief carvings at her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, an architectural masterpiece built into the cliffs across the Nile from Thebes. After her death, for reasons still debated among historians, many of her monuments were defaced and her name removed from official king lists, though whether this reflected genuine hostility from Thutmose III or a more routine effort to reinforce strict male succession remains uncertain. The religious life of the New Kingdom reached its most dramatic and controversial turning point during the reign of Amenhotep IV, who ascended the throne around 1353 BCE. Early in his reign, Amenhotep IV initiated a sweeping religious revolution, elevating a previously minor solar deity called the Aten, represented as a sun disk with rays ending in small hands, above all other gods in the Egyptian pantheon. He changed his own name to Akhenaten, meaning something like effective spirit of the Aten, and relocated Egypt's religious and administrative capital to a newly built city called Akhenaten, modern-day Amarna, constructed rapidly on previously unoccupied land specifically dedicated to the new solar cult. This period, known as the Amarna era, saw significant shifts not only in religion but also in artistic style, with royal portraiture adopting unusually elongated, stylized forms quite different from the idealized rigid conventions of earlier Egyptian art. Akhenaten's religious reforms proved deeply unpopular with Egypt's powerful priesthood, particularly the priests of Ammonius at Thebes, whose wealth and influence had grown enormous over previous centuries, and whose temples were now stripped of resources and, in some cases, actively persecuted. Akhenaten's reign remains one of the most intensely studied and debated periods of Egyptian history, partly because of his controversial religious agenda, and partly because of his famous wife, Nefertiti, whose stunning painted limestone bust, discovered in the early 20th century, remains one of the most recognized images from the ancient world. After Akhenaten's death, the Amarna experiment collapsed with remarkable speed. His young successor, a boy named Tutankhamun, changed his name to Tutankhamun, restoring the worship of Ammonius and abandoning Akhenaten, moving the capital back to Thebes and Memphis. Tutankhamun died young, likely still in his teens, and would have remained a minor and largely forgotten pharaoh in the historical record had his nearly intact tomb, remarkably undisturbed by ancient tomb robbers, not been discovered in the Valley of the Kings in 1922, an archaeological event that captivated the entire world and produced an unparalleled collection of golden artifacts, providing extraordinary insight into royal burial practices of the era. The New Kingdom reached perhaps its most militarily celebrated moment under Ramesses II, who ruled for an extraordinarily long 66 years beginning around 1279 BCE, and who became so associated with royal power and monumental construction that later generations of Egyptians and even foreign visitors often referred to him simply as Ramesses the Great. Early in his reign, Ramesses II led Egyptian forces against the powerful Hittite Empire, Egypt's great rival in the Near East, at the massive Battle of Kadesh in modern Syria, one of the largest chariot battles in recorded ancient history. Though Egyptian temple inscriptions portray the battle as a resounding personal triumph for Ramesses, most historians consider the actual outcome closer to a strategic stalemate. What followed the battle, however, was genuinely historic. Roughly 16 years later, Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hatshepsut III concluded a formal peace treaty, preserved today in both Egyptian hieroglyphic and Hittite cuneiform versions, generally regarded as the oldest surviving peace treaty in world history, establishing mutual non-aggression and an early form of extradition agreement between the two great powers. Ramesses II's building projects matched his long reign in ambition and scale. He constructed the enormous rock-cut temples at Abu Simbel in southern Egypt, their facades dominated by 4 colossal seated statues of the pharaoh himself, each over 20 meters tall, along with extensive additions to the temple complexes at Karnak and Luxor, and his own mortuary temple, the Ramesseum, on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes. These projects were not merely religious or funerary in purpose. They were deliberate acts of political theater, designed to project the permanence and overwhelming power of Ramesses and, by extension, of Egypt itself, to both his own subjects and to any foreign visitors or potential enemies who might see them. Despite these towering achievements, the new kingdom's power gradually declined in the centuries following Ramesses II's death. Later pharaohs faced increasing pressure from waves of foreign invaders, most notably a mysterious coalition of raiders and migrants referred to in Egyptian texts as the Sea Peoples, whose origins remain debated but who are believed to have contributed to the broader collapse of several Bronze Age civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. Egypt itself survived this turbulent period, unlike several of its Near Eastern neighbors, largely due to successful military resistance under Ramesses III, but the effort drained the treasury and weakened royal authority. Combined with growing internal challenges, including the increasing power and wealth of the Ammonius priesthood at Thebes, which by this point rivaled the pharaoh's own authority in the south, the centralized might of the new kingdom slowly eroded, setting the stage for the fragmented and often foreign-dominated centuries that would follow this extraordinary golden age of Egyptian imperial power.